itself out in order to pass through that column. Okay, so that's just a minor thing that sometimes helps to create helps to mitigate some problems, especially when you're trying to throw something like a bottle. And even when I do this, sometimes when I throw a bottle, one side of the lip winds up being higher than the other. Okay, so one of the common faults that beginners have is that they open up the mound too wide. Okay, so they use a lot of clay going out that should be used to go up. And just to give you something to aim for, this opening should be about the diameter of one of those energy drink cans. All right, you don't want to open it up too wide, not unless, I mean, at this point, this is the point where you make your first decision about what this pot is going to look like, and that is how wide the base is going to be. Okay, so if you want a vase or a form that has a wide base, then of course you open it up wider than that. But if you want something that's going to be more vertical than horizontal, then you want to make certain that you keep this opening as narrow as possible. Okay, so then we start. I like to lean the wall in because basically that's the direction I want the wall to go. I use the nail of my thumb to create a little undercut. That's like a toe hold that allows me to get up under that mass of clay at the bottom and bring it up. That is a little loose. Okay. First pull. And I want you to see that my finger rings are very close together. All right, and one of the many things that beginners have to learn is how fast your hand should be coming up in relationship to the speed at which the wheel is rotating. Because your finger rings should overlap. You go back down at the bottom, create another foothold, squeeze in, and bring your hands up.
How much pressure are you putting on your inside hand? Or just keeping it steady, or is there a little bit of pushing?
Well, there is some pressure being applied outward. Well, no, I shouldn't say that. The outside hand is the active hand. All right. If you think of the idea of rolling out a piece of dough on a counter, all right, your outside hand is the rolling pin. The inside hand is the counter. So you're pushing the clay that you're squeezing against the inside hand. So the inside hand is applying, or you're using enough muscle power to keep the inside hand stationary. So we go back down to the bottom. We always want to, even though you know maybe later on this opening is going to be wider, you want to throw a cylinder, because it's easier to keep it on center, you want to throw a cylinder whose base is wider than its lip. So it's always slanting inward slightly. That helps to resist some of the centrifugal force. And go back down to the bottom. The wall is a lot thinner now, so the pinch isn't quite as hard, but still steady. All the way up to the top. And as you know, the wall will naturally get thinner as it comes up. So the amount of pressure you're applying down at the base is greater than the pressure that you apply when you start up, and the pressure that you're applying as you're moving up gradually modulates because the wall is naturally getting thinner.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Do you have water in the bottom? Do you need one of those to take the water out, or do you let it sit there until
No,
you're finished?
I usually use a sponge.
Okay.
Usually, unless I'm throwing something that is really narrow, and then I usually use a sponge on a stick. But normally I can just use my hand with the sponge. Okay, so now one of the tools you should have is some kind of rib that is rigid with a straight edge. Okay? And I like to use that. I pulled this up 3 times, and usually that's what I aim for. 3 pulls. But before I start shaping this cylinder, what I want to do is I want to get rid of the finger rings, and sometimes ribbing it down helps to get rid of any isolated wiggles. And you can see the lip is fairly level. And the lip is level because I centered that wall before I started pulling it up. Alright, so let's take a look at what it looks like. Do an autopsy.
Your wire's on the floor.
My wire's on the
Right
floor.
between your
Oh,
legs.
okay, I see it. Thanks. Okay, and so this is, I'll rotate it so you all can see it. This is a reasonably well-thrown cylinder. The walls are even, slightly tapering as it goes up, relatively straight. We don't want this to be too thin, especially if, and here again, this is why it's important to have some idea of where you're going. Because if I wanted to make a bulbous shape, then I have to leave the walls in the center at least a little bit thicker, so that when I start stretching it out and the wall naturally gets thinner, it doesn't get so thin that it collapses. Okay. So level lip, the base was, wider than the top.
Yeah.
Oh, what?
I got that one. The
What?
cable.
Oh, no, actually, I needed to put my tools. Okay,
That's great.
okay, so that's the basic cylinder. And you don't always throw a perfect cylinder. Sometimes the cylinder's a little too thin, whoops, in the middle, and sometimes it's a little too thick in the middle. But generally speaking, it should be within a certain range. So let's do this again, and let's shape the cylinder.
I'm gonna just chime in here for 1 second. I love what David just did. It's okay to cut it open and destroy it. Speaking as the art director who does not want to go bankrupt, you don't have to fire everything.
Yeah,
Okay?
right.
All right. It's okay to say goodbye.
You see, I am the grandfather who comes and spoils the kids and then goes. Then sends them home.
I'm gonna eat your cookies, David.
Oh, you gotta eat my cookies. Okay, so center this. It's wobbling a little bit, but let's open it up anyway. And take advantage of the tunnel method. can see it's wobbling. But basically, all we need is a little coaxing to get it symmetrical and centered. And when you're doing this, you should apply the pressure gradually. You shouldn't suddenly squeeze it. And then when you are squeezing it, to relax the pressure gradually, and then take your hands off. Okay, so let's pull this up. Brush it a little bit this time, and you
Is that
can
a
see
hint?
that in the fact that my finger rays are more pronounced.
Say that again, they're more pronounced because
I'm
what?
coming up faster.
Oh.
I'm rushing a little bit.
And now your inside ring finger is slightly above your outside ring finger, or are they fairly even?
My outside middle finger is just ever so slightly below my inside middle finger. So I'm applying pressure
Not enough
mostly
so
with
it's
this.
an S, but just so that it's just slightly.
Yeah, because
above.
one of the things you have to realize is that the outside hand can go all the way down to the wheel head. The inside hand can't because you have a thickness of clay.
Is that about the distance it should be, the difference between the bottom,
Yeah, right.
that and the?
Yeah, but there are some potters who say that they should be exactly opposite each other, you know? And like I said, you can have 10 potters in a room and each will be doing the same thing differently. So, you know, whatever works for you. For me, it just makes more sense that the inside hand is going to be slightly higher, but not much more than that. You know,
Okay, so it's not-
and the clay wall is between them. So the clay wall is going like that between them. So let's stitch this in a little tighter. And your pots are not always going to be perfectly symmetrical or perfectly centered. Sometimes they'll wobble a little bit. And sometimes I feel that some of my pots that are a little wonky, just a little bit. Not so much that I can't control them, but just a little bit, or have a bit more character. So I want to get the top of this in. And here you can see the lip is just a little bit uneven. Okay, so now, how many pulls was that? 3? Okay, lose count. The wall feels good, so it must have been 3. Since I do a lot of decorating during the leather heart stage, I prefer not to have the throwing marks on the surface of the pot. So I spend a certain amount of time trying to rib it down so that it's fairly smooth.
You ever
So-
use a rib on the inside? No.
Or I use a rib sometimes on the inside to expand.
Okay,
the
to
form
expand, not to
out,
smooth
but
it
not
out. Okay.
not to smooth the surface. Okay, so let's make what might be considered the conventional vase shape, you know, some kind of form that swells to a certain point and back in, and then to a neck a shoulder, a neck, and a lip that flares. So we go inside. I like to use a sponge in my hand on the inside. Go all the way down to the bottom. Start pushing out gradually. You should be able to start to see the wall change. Important not to come up too quickly. Although if you want to make a pot that kind of has a wobble to it, then you can do that deliberately by coming up very fast. Decide how much of the cylinder you want to be the body of the pot and leave yourself enough cylinder at the top to do whatever you want to do in terms of finishing the form. Now I usually throw with a mirror in front of me, and I actually brought one, but I figured if I put that up, you wouldn't be able to see what I was doing. So you can see that the shoulders wobbling a little bit. I can try to straighten that out by just squeezing it ever so slightly. More than changing the thickness, I'm just trying to straighten out the wall. And then let's finish this. Now sometimes you'll see a demonstration of what not to do. And so this clay is a little bit softer than I'm accustomed to, and I think I got the upper part just a little too thin. But let's see if I can save it. So after I've gotten the general shape and proportions, then I like to use a flexible metal rib to refine the curve, and then also to make a detail to kind of segment the form.
What's the difference between using a plastic rib or metal rib? Like when would you use one or the other?
A metal rib, if you flex it, it doesn't flex in the opposite direction. Who asked that question? Oh, it doesn't flex this way. I should have brought. Is there a soft? Oh, you have one. Here, let me borrow that just to illustrate. This has a straight edge and it's flexible, but it also flexes this way slightly as well. And so that's why I prefer to use a metal rib, because I can get a much more precise curve. And it doesn't give the contour of the rib, or the shape of the rib doesn't give as you press it against the wall. So we just I had an undergraduate professor in college throwing, Joseph Gilliard, a very knowledgeable ceramic artist. He was more interested in the technology related to ceramics, like formulations of glaze recipes and clay body development and stuff like that. But he always used to say that, a well-designed pot has something strong at the bottom, something strong at the top, and something simple in the middle. So I don't always agree with that, but it's some place to start because it is important what the bottom looks like. And so one of the things I like to do is I like a lot of my pots to have small bases or bottoms or foot rings. Kind of makes them look more like a ballerina than a sumo wrestler. Yeah. And so I trim away that excess clay down at the very bottom by using the wooden modeling tool and using this edge to push the clay away from the wall, and then a needle tool, and you go all the way down to the wheel head with this tool, and then you get a ring of clay at the bottom that you can just peel off and be used. Okay, so all right. So that's the kind of classical, traditional vase shape, kind of, I think, Asian, Chinese in origin. Okay, so let's see if we can do a variation on that. Wheel throwing is really kind of quite an amazing process, and that's why even after throwing on the potter's wheel for over 60 years, I am still fascinated watching even beginners throw. And when you think about it, it's such an elegant process in the sense that once there's a seemingly infinite variety of shapes you can make on the potter's wheel. And basically, you can make all of those once you learn how to push out or squeeze in. And so, a lot of times when I'm sitting down and I've got a drawing in front of me of a shape I'd like to see if I could make, and in the process of getting to that shape, I pass through dozens of other shapes. And sometimes I discover that the shapes that I pass through are more interesting than the one. So sometimes when you go on a journey and you have a destination and you take a side trip, a side route, and you discover something that you hadn't expected. To me, kind of throwing on the potter's wheel is like that. And that's why I like to throw with a mirror in front of me, because then I start to see other possibilities. I remember reading an interview by a famous American sculptor when I was in undergraduate school, when I was reading an issue of Art News. I don't even know if they still publish that magazine, but anyway, they were interviewing David Smith, who I think was a professor of sculpture at Cornell at some point during the 60s and 70s. But at any rate, they interviewed him, and one of the last questions that they asked in the interview was what he felt was the most difficult part of making art. And he said, for him, the most difficult part of making art is for every piece he made, it generates 10 new ideas, and there's never enough time to make them all. And that's kind of like what happens when you throw on the potter's potter's wheel, you pass through a lot of other shapes in order to get to where you want to go. And sometimes you stop and change your direction. And sometimes you say, well, I'll remember that, and of course you won't. So this time I'm not going to risk pulling the cylinder too thin. I'm going to deliberately keep it relatively thick up here. I can thin it out later on as I need it once I decide what I'm going to do with it. And these are decisions you can make depending upon where you're going. When you're teaching someone to throw on the wheel, you have to be, at least I think, you have to be pretty narrow in terms of what you want them to do. So the cylinder has to be a certain thickness, the base has to be a certain thickness, the lip has to be a certain thickness, on and on and on. And that's because you want them to understand the parameters of the process, of that aspect of the process. But if you're going to throw a really bulbous form, your walls should be 3 to 4 times thicker than they would be if you're going to throw something like that. And so all of this is relative, but that's to keep introductory kids from making pots that are just basically a lump of clay with a hole in it, so they aren't 3-pound doorknobs, doorstops. Okay, so I'm going to keep this thick, all right, which is about that thick. All right, what is that? Maybe about 3/8 of an inch. About 3/8 of an inch. Because my intent, where I want to go, is a fairly bulbous form. But I left it fairly thick up here. All right, because I'm going to use that clay to make the shoulder and the neck of this form. Okay, so go down to the bottom, and I'm being aggressive in terms of pushing out, because I know I got a lot of clay there that I can stretch out. And I'm pushing out as I go up, and then also as I go down, but not as much. Okay, so
Staying over at like 4 or 5 o'clock with the leader pushing out with a spine.
right between 3 and 4. Okay, so make this bulbous part a little bigger.
And this is what you were talking about, being heavy at the top and heavy at the bottom, right?
Heavy at the top, no,
I think he said
strong at the
Strong.
strong. In terms of shape,
Yeah, yeah.
not in terms of thickness.
Oh,
In
okay.
terms of shape.
Okay.
So, my undergraduate professors kind of mantra for intros, wheel throwing classes, is that if you're trying to think of a nice pot, the foot ring should be strong or dominant, and I tool the bottoms of all my pots. And something simple in the middle, like a simple curve, or maybe even a more complex curve, but I'll make one of those. But and something strong at the top. In other words, you want the pot to end, you want the pot to look like you ended it deliberately and didn't run out of clay.
Yeah, okay,
Okay?
alright.
So let's pull this up. See, I've got a lot of clay here, so I can make this, thin it out and make it much taller.
Are you also thinking about somewhat what kind of flowers might be appropriately done in that pot?
No.
I mean, just saying because the shape of the top.
Well,
You
well,
let
obviously.
the flower arranger do that.
Well, you know, I like the way in which the lip flares out.
Yeah.
All right, but it flares out for a reason, and that's to put flowers in them so that the bouquet, you know, blossoms. You know, but I'm not thinking, well, I'm going to bring it out at a certain angle because I want the foot. No, my job is to make the pot visually interesting to my standards, and then whoever does whatever they do with it is up to them. But yeah, the point you're making, there are some potters who are working with flower arrangers, you know, or whose work is based upon flower arranging, you know, and they're very particular about how the lip ends. You know, sometimes even bringing the lip in, the shoulder in, and just having an opening for a particular kind of flower. But I'm not that sophisticated. Okay, so I want you guys to spend some time drawing this morning, so I'll just demonstrate one more thing after this. And then if some of you have a shape that you would like for me to demonstrate how I go about making it, I'd be glad to do that as well. But this is supposed to be a hands-on workshop. And so I'm supposed to watch you struggle.
How much water do you have on the inside?
How much water what?
Do you have on the inside when you run?
Right now?
Yes?
None.
None. And when you push out with the sponge, like how spongy would you say?
Oh, the sponge is not saturated.
Okay.
Okay, actually, I like the sponge because it cuts down on the amount of lubrication I have to use because the sponge is wet. But I usually squeeze it out before I do that, all right? But also the sponge forces me to put my fingers together in order to hold it. And you want, whenever possible, you want your fingers to be together, all right? Because that allows you to influence a wider area, a surface area, but it also makes your tool more rigid so your fingers aren't flopping all over the place, changing the shape of your pot. So this would just be kind of a variation on that idea. See, the pot is wobbling a little bit. You know how to stop that?
Stop here,
Now you can't see the wobble, right? A lot of these pots that you see in museums and galleries, if you put them back on the wheel, they're probably not as symmetrical as they look, you know. But it isn't about that. It's about what it looks like when it's sitting still. So sometimes we get all hung up with the idea that the pot has to be perfectly symmetrical. And there are some artists who really work very hard at that, and I'm not poo-pooing them. It's just that sometimes it's you discard a really nice pot because you think it isn't perfect. Okay. So now let's do a bottle. Relax. Just relax. See, all of these two are based upon the same idea. Some kind of, well, in this particular case, it would be an inverted cone with a hemisphere to an inverted cone. You know, and sometimes you can approach designing pots by working with that idea that a pot, a particular shaped pot, is a composition of some basic geometric shapes, like the cylinder, the inverted cone, the hourglass, the hemisphere, and the sphere. And then sometimes just sitting down with a sketch pad and drawing out those shapes and combining them in varying ways, you come up with some interesting things. Some of them might be just variations on a fairly conventional form idea or design, or something that's quite revolutionary or unusual.
Excuse me, David.
Yeah.
The diameter of your base compared to your top opening, it seems like a consistent ratio I'm looking at. Like there, it's maybe. Are you
Purely-
thinking about that? I mean, it's a
It's
little
purely
smaller than the
coincidental.
top, but
It's purely coincidental.
Okay.
You know, it's not something that I'm.
conscious of. It's
Yeah,
just-
because
yeah.
when I cut that clay away
Uh-huh.
from the bottom,
Right.
I'm not just cutting clay away from the bottom. I'm also pushing that wall in at the same time, and so sometimes it'll wind up wider or narrower. But what I want to have is a certain diameter so that I can put a foot ring in it. And so when I trim that extra clay away, the base diameter winds up being too wide, I just trim it in further with a trimming tool to make the foot ring. And if it's too narrow, then I don't trim anything away from the diameter, I just form the foot ring.
David,
So, yeah.
I wanted to ask you, is this the foot ring, or are you talking about this foot
The
ring?
foot-
Like, I
I'm-
love this.
I'm talking about that little thing that looks like a pedestal
Yes.
that the pot is sitting
Right.
on. Yeah, the foot ring.
So
Yeah.
I'm fascinated how you made this one come this way.
Oh, well, that was done during the leather heart stage, during the tooling process, and that's what we'll talk about next session.
Okay.
Okay, because
Sorry.
by then I hope some of you will have some leather hard pots that are ready to be tooled. Okay? But I don't want to take up too much of your time this first session talking about tooling. And so we'll talk about that next session. What you'll have to do is at least keep some of your pots in the leather hard stage until we come back. not a week from tomorrow, right?
Within a mile.
Okay, so let's, here again, pull the cylinder up. There are so many things you have to keep track of when you're drawing on the potter's wheel that if they're not committed to muscle memory, you'll go crazy. It's like learning to play a musical instrument. And muscle memory is created through repetition. Okay, so this one I'm only going to pull up 2 ties because here again I want to make a fairly bulbous form.
Do you have any foolproof tricks for working with those shifty bats?
Ignore them. Just concentrate on the pie. Shifty bats, sometimes you can put a clay slurry under the bat, and that'll create a slight suction, which will keep it from chucking so much. You know, it happens with bats. I use plywood bats, and what happens occasionally, some of them wind up getting, the holes wind up getting ovaled slightly. And so what I do is I just fill it in with wood putty and drill another set of holes.
Always, okay. Yeah, 'cause filling it with clay doesn't work enough to let it dry overnight instead.
What?
We are always trying to stuff clay down in there, but it's not hard enough to.
Oh, no, I mean under the bat. Put down a slurry of clay on the wheel head and then put the bat on top of it, and that'll create a suction sometimes.
Also, sometimes if you put a piece of paper, like paper towel, over the bat, then before.
Oh,
you put the
that'll
bat
make the
on,
bat pin slightly
then that-
bigger. Yeah.
Make paper mache bat stuff in.
Yeah, there are a lot of those little annoying things that happen when something gets used over and over again. Okay, so let's, here again, belly out. None of you have asked the question I expected.
Don't talk about me.
Well, why don't you have your hand on the outside
Yeah, I was noticing that.
while you're bellying these things out? Well, I used to throw bulbous forms like that. Then we had a visiting artist, a potter by the name of Makoto Yabe, who unfortunately has since passed away. But at any rate, he was demonstrating one of the Japanese throwing techniques where you throw a cylinder, decorate the cylinder, and then expand it out into a ball. And it happened to coincide with some ideas that I had for decorating, which were kind of based on vegetable forms at the time. And so I adopted that technique, and I discovered that I was able to throw forms that were more bulbous, and the curves were more fluid if I didn't use my hand on the outside.
Probably requires a much more delicate touch though, right?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it takes some getting used to. Okay, so let's hope that I've left myself enough clay to make a bottleneck. Bring this in. The most important thing is to keep that shoulder domed so it doesn't collapse in. And this is too thick up here, so I'm thinning this down. And you can see it's uneven. I'll live with that for a while. Until it becomes annoying. Bring clay up on the shoulder. Slowly bring the diameter up of the neck in, trying to maintain that dome shoulder. Just trying to get a bit better idea of what, if I had the mirror in my mind, I could see the contour here. I could also see under as well. Make that little separation between the neck. Shoulder. That little lip. Oh, you probably can't see what I'm doing, so I'll explain it. I'm holding this tool parallel to the surface of the pot. So I'm holding it like that, okay? Not like this, which would be perpendicular to the surface of the pot. And I'm using the fat edge. And I'm using the fat edge because it will have a tendency to spread the clay away from the pot, whereas the thin edge will create a suction and the tool will be harder to control because the clay will be trying to grab it. So if you use it the wrong way, it will spread the clay away from the pot. And then you just follow the logical extension of the curve. Down. Hold the tool steady, because the clay will try to pull it out of your hand, and you go all the way down to the wheel head. You create a ring of clay around the bottom of the pot, and then you use your needle tool to cut that ring away from the wheel head and just peel it away. This is clay that you won't have to deal with in leather art stays cool. Okay. And so then we'll take this off. I'll demonstrate one more thing, then we'll get to work. Demonstrate that technique that the Japanese potter demonstrated. And that is decorating the cylinder. Okay, so you can, once you get the cylinder thrown, you can alter its surface. You can alter it by scratching something into it, or you can alter it by painting the surface with an on-go or slip, and then doing sgraffito through it. The idea, though, is that once you decorate it, you can't touch it. So to turn it into a bulbous form, you can only apply pressure from the inside. So I got this little, I don't know where I found this thing, but it's just what looks like a saw blade, some point, really coarse teeth. And we'll use this to serrate the surface and supporting it gently from the inside so I don't collapse the cylinder end. let's just straighten it out a little bit. If you're going to do this particular technique, you might want to make the walls just a little thick, because if you make them too thin and you serrate the surface, you may wind up stretching it and it popping through or breaking through. Then we use what's left at the top. No, you can see what it looks like. Sometimes go back in. Push it out even further. Okay, so here's something that some of you might want to try. Of course, if you use on gold on the outside, you have to throw it on a bat because you can't pick it up. But this I should be able to pick up without destroying so much. Okay?
Thank
Time
you.
is